Hi everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. The 12-bar blues is probably the most common song structure that we have. And it's important to check it out because you want to have some more options when you're soloing. You want to be able to comp other people well, and of course you also want to make it as easy as possible to learn different blues themes. So in this video I'm going to go over how to analyze it. I'm going to go over some common variations, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about what scales to use, how you deal with them and how you understand them, and in that way make it just easier for you to understand the 12-bar blues progression on a little bit of a deeper level. This is a very basic 12-bar jazz blues. So of course the blues in the way that you'll find it with Muddy Waters or Eric Clapton is going to be a little bit different, but I'm going to focus on the jazz blues in this video. So I think sort of a good place to start would be the progression that I just played. I took the key of F because I think also that's the most common key for a jazz blues. So if we just go over the different bars, basically a blues has just a lot of tonic, some subdominant and some dominant. That's really, it's a simple progression in that way. It's not really too embellished because it's also just a very sort of short 12 bar, very basic progression. Of course we start on the 1 and then the 4th degree back to the 1, another bar of 1, and then 4th degree, and then another bar of 4th degree, 1, and then usually you'll get some sort of cadence to the 2nd degree, so that would be in this case A half diminished D7, which just is an auxiliary cadence to G minor, and then we go to the 2-5-1, so 2, 5, and then once back on the 1 here in the last 2 bars we get some sort of turnaround. In jazz it's most likely to be some sort of 1-6-2-5, 3-6-2-5 variation, so and then we start on the next chorus. The thing with the blues is of course the way we play it now, the tonic chord is actually a dominant chord, so that almost makes it a little bit atonal. And also if you listen to earlier versions of blues, like, well actually if you hear Charlie Parker solo on the blues, he will play something that's not really clearly suggesting a dominant until he gets to bar 4, and then he'll start really emphasizing sort of that sound, so you get. And that I think is coming out of the fact that it used to be a little bit more tonal. It used to be so that you would hear just the major chords or maybe a major 6 chord and not a dominant chord for the entire progression. But the way it's been since I think since swing and bebop, it's been all dominant chords, and that's also what we're going to do. So I'm just going to analyze it as if the F7 is actually a tonic chord. That seems to make the most sense. So really what we have is, with a small step to the 4th degree, we have the first 4 bars which are just tonic, and then the second 4 bars is first subdominant and then tonic again, and then the last 4 bars is the 2-5-1, and in this case I would say the 2-5-1 is probably more like a dominant, and then back to the 1 where we also have the turnaround. That's sort of the general idea if you split up the form and try to look at it as 3 different 4-bar sequences. So I think some of the things that you first need to spot and get used to and also almost ignore is the fact that the way we treat the dominants are going to be the same way that we treat any dominance in any sort of cadence whenever they're resolving. So that means that in bar 4, just before we go to the 4th degree, then you might find, so in the key of F, the way I played it in the beginning was F, but you can also just have like a complete cadence, so C minor, F7 to B flat, just to create a little bit of movement and create that transition. Of course it can also be F7 altered to B flat, so that's going to be a change. Or even a tritone substitute, or even a complete tritone 2-5. And really it's all the same. There's not really too much happening, and you of course have to play the changes the way you want them. But these are also the kind of changes that you can insert in your solo in any way you want, and how you can be completely free with it really. The same goes for the cadence back to the 1, once you're in the final case of the G minor, C7 to back to F in bar, so that's bar 9 and 10. So the C7 can be altered, you can turn it into a Tritone II V. There are the same kind of options, and they don't really have too much of an influence on the sound. There's not too much happening that you wouldn't find anywhere else, I think. So I'm not gonna really go into too much detail with that, because playing tritone substitutes and alter dominants, I have a ton of videos on that already, so I don't think you need to hear about that here. The place where the most things are happening with the chord progression in a blues is probably when it's on the 4th degree. So we're in bar 5, and in this case like bFlat7, and then the journey back to the 1, so in bar 6, is sort of filled in 2 different ways. Probably the most common one is the sharp 4 diminished. So if I play a 12-bar blues with the sharp 4 diminished, then that will sound like this. Once we're on the bFlat7 in bar 5, so here, then we go to B diminished, and that's going to take us back to the F7. I think strictly speaking, it's probably going to take us back to an F7 or some sort of F with a C in the bass, but that's not always played like that. And for soloing and comping reasons, you don't really have to do it like that. You can just think of it as being B diminished, going back to F7. So that's what we call a sharp 4 diminished. I think it's kind of clear in the way I play it here that the only thing changing is really just 4th degree and then a 4th degree with a raised root. So in that respect, it's a really good example of what a sharp 4 is, and it's unbelievable how often I get to hear that sharp 4 doesn't exist. So the blues themes that you'll find that use this would be something like Tenor Madness, Blue Monk, and Straight No Chaser, and it's probably the most common version of it to have this diminished in there. The good thing about the sharp 4 is of course also that it gives us the blue note, so in that way, sort of this functional harmony trick is gonna give us some of the blues flavor as well, and I think that's probably the reason why it's used so often. And what you play on it, so of course on the bFlat7 normally you would just play a Mixolydian scale, so that in this case is an E-flat major scale over the bFlat7, and then I would say that when you want to play the B diminished, then you just take that scale and change the B flat into a B, and then you get C harmonic minor. So that will be sort of the scale that will go with this chord, and then that resolves sort of quite nicely into the F7. I think the trick is probably a little bit, if you find that difficult, you can think of the B diminished as resolving to some sort of C minor on the F7, because if we look at the F7 here, then we have a C minor triad as an upper structure. So those notes will work really well, and you can easily target those with the diminished. So that's an easy way to get from the B diminished back to the F7. And it's also a good place to just get used to the whole sharp 4 diminished sound, in part because it's in the theme of a lot of songs, and also just because it's a place where it's very common, and you have a little bit more time to play it. It's not sort of in the middle of a standard with a bunch of chords. So for that reason, it's worthwhile thinking about the fact that you can use this. The other option that we have for bar 6, so the second bar of the subdominant, is to not go to a sharp 4, but then go to a 4 minor. And most of the time in a blues, that means that we'll be going to bFlat7 and then, or directly to E-flat7, and then back to F. You'll find that quite a lot in Coltrane themes, actually, that he does that. And also to make it into a 2-5. So B-flat minor, E-flat7, and then back to the tonic. There's not really a lot to say about that. When you have the B-flat minor, E-flat7, then you just play it using the A-flat major scale, because that's pretty much the sound you're going to get out of this. And you could opt for, if you only want to play the E-flat7, then make it into a Lydian dominant, so really like B-flat melodic minor, And those two, I mean, they're only one note apart, so it's also not a huge difference in that way. You have the D flat that wants to resolve down, so it's basically just a 4 minor chord in a major. Even though our tonic chord is a dominant here, it's still just a 4 minor. So B flat minor 6 resolving down to, in this case, an F7. The themes that use the 4 minor option would be a song like Ornette Coleman's Turnaround, and you'll also find it in a lot of Parker Blues themes because it's part of the Parker Blues progression as well. Even though I'm kind of leaving out the Parker Blues because that's a little bit sort of separate chapter of blues as far as I'm concerned. Also because you don't really use that as much as a reharmonization. But the 2/5 making bar 6 into a 2/5 is something that's used really often to sort of use as a gateway into some other 2/5 movement and using some parallel 2/5 stuff, which I'm going to get to in a bit. So that's also an important part of that, and you'll hear people do that all the time, also just on top of a normal blues progression, and really use that. Let's see, so other songs that use it, Chi-Chi from Parker also has a 4 minor in bar 6. So it is less common than the diminished, but it is definitely something you'll come across. Going back from the subdominant in bar 7, often you'll just go back to the tonic, so really just to an F7, and then you get some sort of cadence to the 2 chord in bar 9. So in this case that would be like A half diminished D7. You will find also sometimes that it'll really become A minor to a D7. I think, which one does that? Billy's Bounce has that. So there are places where you really get an A minor there. For the rest, I think mostly it's safer to just, it is a cadence to a minor chord, so you will probably play it like a minor cadence also. The other thing that can happen is that, especially if you have the 4 minor option, so we're first on B flat 7, then B flat minor 7, and then we can actually start getting into this whole parallel 2/5 progression that we can use, so that we're going from B flat minor, E flat 7, A minor, D7, A flat, D flat, and then we're on G minor. A 12-bar blues with these chromatic 2/5s would sound like this. That way of just using a lot of parallel movement, and of course that is part of if you learn what's called Blues for Alice or Freight Train or other Parker Blues themes, that's used in there, and that's always part of the progression, but it's also just a nice thing to have in your vocabulary for when you're soloing at some point, and then really just start using these shifting chromatic minor things or 2/5 things. And of course you don't have to think of them. I think when you do that, you don't really have to think of them as just being complete 2/5s all the time, because that might be a little bit clunky melodically, that you really have to be to get to the 5 eventually. So it can also just make sense to have some sort of other pattern and then just think the minor chord. I'm not entirely sure because I never transcribed Matrix from Chick Corea, but I think he uses that quite a lot in there. At least there are a few places where it really sounds like he's sort of going for the parallel minor thing at that point in the form. So that could be a place to check that out. And it's a very useful thing to just have to throw in there. And it's also something you can probably expect other soloists to do for sure, because it is a very common thing to do. Then, well, we have the normal 2/5, so the G minor, C7 in bar 9 and 10. Every now and again you will find variations that the minor blues would actually have a D flat 7 to C7, and you do have variations of a blues where they use that, so they won't play G minor, but they'll play D flat 7 down to C7 and then the turnaround. But mostly it's actually left like this, so they will leave the 2/5 as the sort of defining cadence of the key really, and then the turnaround, which is, I already made a video with a bunch of different turnarounds, and you can of course add whatever you want in there. That was some of the most common jazz blues variations that you're probably likely to encounter if you start checking out sort of bebop or hard bop era blues themes. And of course there are a lot more variations available. I think I try to keep this a little bit shorter and just try to cover really the ones that are you're very likely to come across and that you really do want to be able to recognize, because they're also going to be the things that are going to be played at sessions most of the time. If there's something that you think I missed, if you have a very common blues progression that I should mention as well, then leave a comment on the video. Maybe it's something I can return to later. Of course, I know, as I also said in the video, I left out the Parker blues and some of the other variations, because there are some really great variations. Especially Coltrane did some really interesting things with different dominant change and putting them in there and working them into the progression in different ways. So that's worth checking out. And of course also, as I said, the Parker blues, which really is just sort of back cycling to create a long progression that's going to lead us to the 4th degree in bVII. And the reason why I left it out was just because it seems to be a completely different progression in many ways, and it's also something that's not used very often as a reharmonization. So in that way it kind of stands alone, even though there are themes that are using it that are fairly famous, and there are a few different variations on the Parker blues as well. So there's of course the basic blues for Alice, but in many ways West Coast blues also has some Parker blues things going on, and bluesette is also really a Parker blues, but then taking a little bit further. So there are some interesting things about Parker blues, and that is something I can return to in another video if you want me to. Just leave a comment, let me know. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, and this is the first time you see one of my videos, then subscribe to my channel. I publish a new video every Monday and Thursday, and I've been doing this for quite some time, so there's already a lot of material available on my channel. If you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. I'm very grateful for the support that I'm getting from my patrons, and that's really what makes it possible for me to keep on going and making all these videos. If you join me on Patreon, I can also give you something in return for your support. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next time.